The first few slides are just there to share a little bit about my journey so far in getting here to this conversation with you all, as indeed we are all along continued journeys in our teaching and learning expertise process, right, as Helen was saying this morning. So on the next slide, you'll see these are my contexts, my cultures, my disciplines, right, all of those keywords that we're saying. Pete, on the next slide. My context, my cultures, my disciplines, my habitus, my epistemologies, right? My ways of interpreting the world and making meaning come from a variety of contexts. So I'll quickly just talk through the few next slides. My BA was in Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Padova. On the next one, Pete. And I was then in the UK for a little while studying English. And I was then at the university, at Brown University for my PhD, and then the next one in Rhode Island on the East Coast. It was an interdisciplinary PhD that combined Italian studies and theater arts and performance studies. And that's where, thanks to my work at the Sheridan Center, I discovered a deep vocation for supporting professional and organizational development for teaching and learning in higher education, which is what we call educational development, the definition that I've shared in that link for you all. So from then on, both of my hearts have kept beating. My disciplinary one that comes from the arts and humanities and applied theater for intercultural competence, as well as my teaching and learning one. So I've been in spaces on the next slide in which I got to teach, for example, at Dickinson College, theater-based courses of Italian language and culture. But also I professionally identify as someone who supports teaching and learning in higher education. And for example, I was for a few years on the next slide at the University of Rhode Island in the Office for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning. So I get to bring what I call theater-based intercultural educational development, which will be the topic of my presentation, into a variety of spaces across the disciplines for educators in higher ed. For example, on the next one, you'll see a workshop. And from the University of Rhode Island, of course, to my current role at UCC in the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching and Learning, where I am senior lecturer in teaching and learning enhancement. On the next one, you'll see me, for example, running embodied, thank you for the previous presentation, workshops with SEM faculty in a professional development experience, as well as with, on the next slide, for my colleagues, fellow educational developers at this is the International Consortium for Educational Development just this last summer. So a few words about what I mean by theater-based intercultural educational development. On the next slide, I'll share with you my why, my belief in education for liberation and its power of performing better futures into existence. So really changing the world one day at a time. I envision and enact educational spaces as utopian performatives. And I mean by that, through performance studies lens, sites of empowering experimentation, where we encounter the unknown with curiosity and generosity, which are traits of intercultural competence, so that we can co-create new meaning, rehearse revolutionary possibilities. I'm inspired here by the work of Augusto Boal, for example, and thus practice freedom into existence. And I'm breathing with Freire, with bell hooks, of course. And you'll find all the references at the end of the slides if you're interested in more reading. And of course, this is stuff I'm passionate about, so always happy to continue the conversation if you're interested in some of the literature. On the next slide, very quickly, doing a lot of this work, I encounter people, colleagues, spaces, institutional efforts that focus on what in the United States recently has been called JEDI or DEIJ, issues of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. So just very briefly, a couple of words about how I think about these. On the next slide, when I think about inclusion and diversity, I think about sense of belonging, and of course, the fact that we want all of our students to belong authentically in their learning experiences. And intercultural competence, thinking about cultures, as Helen was saying this morning, is the way that I have found so far that mostly helps me make sense of intersectionality. So the fact that each one of us is this unique combination of previous experiences that makes us who we are. And on the next slide, when I think about equity and justice, I think about asking the questions. I don't know if I want to say the right questions, but really continuing asking questions rather than simply settling on easy answers. And asking questions in ways that are respectful across disciplines. On the next slide, when I think about transdisciplinary respect, I'm really thinking about what counts as research, what counts as evidence, what counts as data, right? We're talking about the skills development in fields that are arts-based and what that means in relation to how people, for example, talk about teaching and learning as a science versus a form of art. I call it experiential empathy, respecting those diverse ways of making meaning, those diverse epistemologies, hence why I shared with you a little bit about my cultures and my ways of thinking at the beginning of this presentation. Not only in terms of what Rendon has called the traditionally privileged agreements in higher education, the references there on the slide. For example, the fact that we tend to prefer in our westernized academic world, typically mental knowing above other ways of making meaning or multiple intelligences, just to provide one example. And on the next slide, I want to quickly name a distinction. So I'm talking about drama and theater techniques applied for creative meaning making in educational development. But I want to be specific about a distinction between signature pedagogies of arts for social change and my focus on teaching and learning elements that have applicability across diverse disciplines. Right. So what I do in my practice and in my scholarship is applying those signature pedagogies of participatory performing arts practice for educational development purposes, for the learning of post-secondary educators. And I help them move from the what if that is very scary, right? What if something goes wrong in my class, into the space of generative what if, which is something that arts practitioners embrace in their creative skills development. So on the next slide, I think we're gonna say yes, see some of those traits that I identify as creative meaning making for educational development skills that can help us be more effective educators, promoting self-discovery, heightened awareness of the self, developing empathy. We see all the keywords here, right, that we will be rehearsing and using and exploring together in the time we have. Ability to hold ambiguity and ability to process discomfort. Next slide. So what happens? These are some of the questions that I ask participants in my workshops. What happens when we embrace a yes and perspective? These are some of the types of questions that might come up about how higher ed might look like if we entertain more often these possibilities of shared co-creation. We're gonna probably skip the next one. I think it was some more on Augusto Boal that we won't have time to go into. So if you can go to the next one, Pete, thank you so much. Some of the work that I've done in terms of exploring what this means in terms of a teacher's comfort / discomfort / embracing that space of discomfort comes from my PhD dissertation. I'll just let you read some of the keywords coming out of that work. And on the next slide, I want to encourage us to think about what that means in terms of comfort. Teaching artistry for me means embarking on and facilitating brave spaces for us and for others. What I call interactional safe enough learning zones. I don't think that we can ever be really safe if there's anything to be learned and generated, but safe enough that we can dance with each other. And in seeking that growth, on the next slide, I am blurring here all teachers and learners, all teachers as learners ourselves. We need to play, we need to experiment, we need to take risks, we need to make mistakes, we need to explore possibilities. And the ways that I try to support this intersect two main areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about intercultural competence, and I'm going to talk a little bit about embodiment. So on the next slide, this is how I summarize intercultural competence development in some of the work that I've done and written. The keys for me here is progression from self-awareness, which is needed to then realize that we are that indeed that one unique combination of experiences is just one out of a million possibilities that are infinite. So that helps us move into a space of humility. And from there, hopefully open up some flexibility about the fact that others will see and behave and become differently than we do, and move towards spaces of entertaining this utopian, never completely achievable, but experiential and epistemological empathy, an attempt, always an attempt towards that. On the next slide. This is just a reference on some of the intercultural sensitivity models that I use. We can go on the next one. I try to achieve that through what I call imaginative experiencing. So imaginative experiences prepares us to take action. And this is where applied theater work comes in for me. On the next slide, Augusto Boal helped us thinking about demechanizing our bodies. And I'm really thinking about demechanizing a lot of our habits, right? We know that when it comes to learning something new, the process also involves unlearning something previous, right? Unlearning our habituated repertoires, to say one example, the ways that we were taught ourselves in our disciplines, unlearning those so that we can become agents of change and have expanded repertoires at our disposal. To authentically engage with that, Pete, thank you so much for running with me. To authentically engage on the next slide with any model of inclusive teaching. These are just a couple of examples. There's another one. You can go on the next slide, Pete. Any model of inclusive education out there, these are some of the ones that are meaningful for my practice. Educators need to be able to authentically engage with what we're proposing. So on the next slide, I think key elements of that are transparency, so that people actually own the knowledge, for example, that Helen was referring to. Transparency brings to empowerment, and empowerment brings to being able to act for change. And of course, on the next one, there's going to be a lot of, as I was saying, whichever model of inclusive pedagogy or lens we're using, fantastic work in transparency in teaching and learning, fantastic work in students as partners. Next slide. Incredible work for inclusive education has to do with naming imposter syndrome, recognizing stereotype threat, talking about the hidden curriculum. And again, I know I'm running, but very happy to continue the conversation about any of these. They require educators to work with us or any colleague that they feel like they want to have a significant conversation about teaching and learning in acts of trust. So on the next one, of course, trust requires building relationships. Authentic relationships through dialogue, through care, another keyword that we've already said. And I wanted to say a little bit more about an example of practice, but I know we won't have time. So if you just want to go through a couple more slides for me, Pete, thanks so much. I had a framework here about what it means to develop trust as an educational developer. We can talk about that if it's of interest later on. And these were some of my examples of practice of what I've done in my spheres of influence in my institutions, but we can keep going. Thanks, Pete. Just to the one that says imagining together. These were some examples from my institution. As educators, I think we share a radical utopian optimism, and we share an urgency and impatience for the world that we want to see out there. There's a Twitter there from a colleague of mine during, that couple of years that nobody remembers what happened when, but we all engaged a lot more on Twitter, at least I did, in connection with others that were doing my same work. And he was saying that we cannot yield, if not now, when, if not as who, to support inclusive education in higher education. The artistry of teaching and learning to imagine and perform into existence the world that we want to see out there also means that there are days of hope and there are days of despair. A very good mentor of mine told me that a long time ago. I hope that today is a day of hope for you all, as it is for me, because it's amazing to be part of such a large community, although online. But that means that we actually have the international reach. So I really feel deeply connected with all of you. Thanks for making this 2 weeks of hope. And I look forward to continued conversation. Thanks so much, Pete. That was a run. Oh, and on the next one, there's just my contact. And as if you wanna note down just one word in chat for you, as we say in Theater Labs, to seal the practice, I'd love to see those come in chat. If there's one takeaway that's stuck with you or a keyword that is resonating and you wanna bottle up and keep with you. And otherwise, I'm open for questions, and you'll have my email on the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. Really, really fascinating stuff. And there's lots of Yeah, great reactions in the chat, and again some of the stuff around that kind of tension between the students being more passive in this kind of audience performance concept versus much more active participants in their learning, which I think Helen said is, we'll perhaps hear more about in the next presentation around improv and kind of students coming together to co-create that learning space. We haven't got much time, unfortunately, but perhaps one question just to pull out from the chat is about this kind of this brave space you spoke about, and the extent to which your institution or institutions you worked at in the past, you've had a really fantastic journey through higher education, the extent to which your institutions encourage risk-taking in learning and teaching. What's been your experience of that?
That's a great question, and how much time do we have, right? So this is an important tension, because as educational developers, we often occupy what has been defined as the third space. We're not quite faculty members, academic members, often, and we're not quite administrators. Although in my current role, I am on an academic track in teaching and learning, which creates all sorts of other types of identity perspectives. But what that means is that a lot of the work that we do, and that's why I called it both professional development and organizational development, has to do with supporting the individuals and the organization and the structure behind that. So one example, since you were talking about being true to embracing risk-taking, right? In a lot of my roles, I was both helping instructors putting together their review portfolios in terms of their teaching evidence and practice, at the same time advising leadership about how to look at these materials, right? So it's an interesting tension, because the system will always kind of work towards the more oppressive state and how things have been, and wants to maintain a lot of that. And the agents of change very often act from the top, from the bottom up, right? And we know that those are the bodies that tend to be exhausted, that tend to do a lot of the labor, a lot of the work. So it's a community of practice that can help us keep us going. That's why I was saying some days, real despair. There are some conversations when we are in institutional leadership meetings that really make you feel like the yes and is not going to happen. But just keeping at it and finding those allies and those moments of connection. And I think what you were saying in terms of the embracing the risk-taking, it's interesting that one of the first, maybe the more obvious level of applicability of performance and theater for an educator's persona development, very often, for example, STEM educators go in the space of, oh, how do I become a more effective orator, right? How do I control the room and the space? And all of those things are grand and very helpful for our teaching artistry. But what is more interesting to me is how do we move from there to the actual role, maybe more of a director or participatory arts practitioner, which actually facilitates an ensemble, right? So if we think about that in terms of how we facilitate our students, and if these leaders then think about that in terms of how they facilitate institutional decision-making, that's where I'm hopeful that change can happen, even though some days we are banging the head against the wall. So I